Pooja and Somi for organizing this. So let me get started. I have a PowerPoint to share. All right. Is the PowerPoint visible?
Yes.
Okay, cool, awesome. So I want to start today's presentation with an excerpt from a novel written by Kamaladevi Aravindan called Sembawang. The British brought our ancestors to clear the forest and work in the sugar farms and estates. But none of our ancestors knew that what they were getting into. They could not even read the documents they signed. They were treated worse than slaves and stripped of their dignity, made to live in homes smaller than cowsheds. Many died in these estates, not even once returning to their homes or even seeing their loved ones again. Why? Not even Kranis, who were Indians themselves, had any respect for the coolies. They treated us as worms beneath their feet that they stamped upon. Singaporean writer of Indian descent, Kamaladevi Aravindan's novel Sembawang captures the intersection of estate labor used in Malaysian rubber estates, managed by Konkanis who are like Indian managers. And the novel shows how the estate life dovetails with the rise of migration of professional classes to Singapore in the 1960s. In the epigraph above, the character Munuswamy, an ex-estate Malaysian laborer, ruminates on the plight of many plantation workers who were forced to leave when the plantation changed hands and when the new management took over. The novel's three main characters, Thakan, Kali, and Munuswamy, are imaginary third-generation descendants in the fictional Sembawang. But they're also archetypes of the lineage of laborers commonly called coolies, who were part of the Indian workforce brought into work in Malaya. The term coolie is particularly significant because it is used in a wide variety of colonial contexts. Lynn Holland Lee states that while the word coolie had multiple origins, it's broadly used by Europeans to describe Asian workers of few skills and low status and signal cultural meanings of inferiority and incapacity, which put coolies at the bottom of local social hierarchies that justified their treatment. In this snippet from the novel, Munuswamy, during a brief visit to Chennai, is surprised to see his long separated friend Thakan as a part of a group of men taking arms from the visitors who arrive in the airport. So this novel traces how Kali, a Tamil estate worker, ends up in a Malayalee settlement where multiple families share rooms in a housing unit. So in many ways, Sembawang is a meditation of female love, bonding, and solidarity. Looking at the events around the British naval base, Sembawang sheds light on sub-regional sentiments over linguistic and cultural uprooting while attempting to respond to questions of belongingness and assimilation. While their ethnic identity as Tamil Indian plantation laborers tied these workers to an imagined space of India, their Tamil ethnicity was tied to the cultural and social upbringing in peninsular Malaya as Indian laborers, as opposed to the identity of Indian signaled through claims of territorial Indian citizenship. And this signals a wider inter-Asian disjuncture between ethnicity and fast solidifying rigid frameworks of nationhood. If plantation histories of Malaysia usually center the Tamil-speaking laborer as a primary representative of the Indian community by focusing on other sub-ethnic groups like Malayalis, contributed to the early histories of Singapore and Malaysia. In fact, one of the provocations that the novel puts forth is to interrogate where does Malayalis fit within the CMIO model. And this is the model that's followed in Singapore, Chinese, Malay, Indian, other, and I will get into it in a second. And this is a scheme that racially stereotypes every Singaporean by birth, which is again based on the colonial logic of taxonomy that persists in post-colonial Singapore. Scholars like Kwang Sing Shen and Chua Ben Hua has pointed out that in the absence of cultural or historical unity, but in fact very significant regional and sub-regional differences throughout Asia, there is an urgent demand to move beyond the nation-state boundaries to intersect the regional and the sub-regional. In focusing on Malayalis as part of the larger migration within Asia, my work responds to the scholarship on global Asia that stages an interest in rethinking questions of knowledge production about Asia, as well as to multiply frames of reference and sites of identification. Through a historicized reading of Sembawang, today's talk will look at the complexity of Indian identity within the regional networks of labor and migration. I locate the longer histories of migration of Indian indentured labor used in Malaya and Strait settlement by focusing on the settlement of Tamil and Malayali labor force in the 1960s in Sembawang, which is located in the northern Singapore. Part historical work, part analysis of literature. Today's presentation examines the legacy of Malayali labor migration to Sembawang, and I do so by undertaking the analysis of Aravindan's novel Sembawang, which was published in 2020 in both Tamil and Malayalam. And at this point, I think it might be worth dwelling briefly on why fiction. Hayden White, commenting on Michel de Soto's work on the relationship between history and fiction, remarks that fiction attempts to fill out the domain of the possible or imaginable. While history is interested in documenting truth, fiction is concerned with the real, that is, that which consists of everything that can be truthfully said about its actuality, plus everything that can be said about what it could possibly be. While the truth of Malayali Singapore settlement can be traced through government records, photographs, newspapers, magazines, and other archival sources, they tell us very little about the effective realities of such resettlement. On the other hand, a novel like Sembawang, I argue, take recourse to historical truth but moves a step further. And in this, I align with historian Kalpana Hiralal's use of non-traditional sources as a fictional literary sources in the retelling of such histories. Writing about the gendered aspect of indentured migration in the Indian Ocean region in the 19th and 20th centuries, Hiraral asserts that fictional sources provided her with ingrained perspectives on the challenges and constraints early male migrants endured during migration. Similarly, in the writing of the history of her ancestors' travel in coolie ships, South Asian diasporic writer Minal Hajratwala writes about what she calls an intimate history, a literary non-fiction approach that weaves together journalistic, historic, and ethnographic methods with literary techniques to evoke these feelings for the reader by naming them as possibilities. This approach, Hajratwala claims, is equally about acknowledging that migration is not remembered, but forgotten in equal parts, told as well as concealed or silenced or left unheard. In this Sembawang and its potential to voice the concealed history of migration, I argue, is a crucial part in rethinking of women's place in the history of migrations. While Sembawang allows me to fill this diasporic archive with the effective possibilities of Malayali migration history, Aravindan herself undertakes the same process. Aravindan's novel, while privileging the fictional, is undergirded by the same historical impulse as the one motivating my academic work. Aravindan strategically inserts photographs of people and places, including that of her family and people who lived in Sembawang in the period that the novel is set in. Moreover, there are also historical notes and reference section in the novel that are additions that signals the author's hope for historically informed reception of the novel. The prologue of the book outlines a brief history of indentured labor, which remains a backdrop of the novel, especially the estate labor that the characters were formerly part of. So there are different tiers of hierarchy. Kangani, a supervisor or manager, Periyadurai, big boss, Cheriyadurai, small boss, Krani, recruiter or supervisor. And the description of the plantation economy allows the readers to get a glimpse of how labor was organized. Aravindan's research process resonates with Hajratwala's intimate history, whereby the events are partially reconstructed through research and by setting up the conditions surrounding it, by weaving it within the broader history of Singapore. By using a methodological framing that draws from archival research, ethnography, and interviews with Indian ethnic communities in Singapore and Malaysia, and by interrogating the varied modes used to recount historical narratives about labor, migration, and racialization, I ask, why does historical fiction becomes an entry point for Aravindan to weave, the history of Malayali community in Singapore, and what do such works and historical context they deal with tell us about the ways inter-Asian undercurrents and formations were scaffolded into the discussion of regional identities in estate labor? How can we see works such as Sembawang attempting to engage with sub-ethnic articulations in a context where sub-ethnic groups within India, like Malayalis, Telugu, and Sikhs were bracketed under the Tamil-dominant ethnicity in the CMIO model? How can we study such histories at a time when researchers from the Singaporean community are writing their own histories and unpacking threads from their past that were left out of the dominant accounts? So the first section is titled Indentured Diaspora and the South Indian Strait Settlement. The migration of Malayalis to the Malayan Peninsula dates back to the 12th century, when it was occasioned by the influx of Malabari warriors who accompanied the Portuguese to Singaporean shores. Early evidence of Indian presence in southern Kedah and province Wellesley is indicated in the form of inscriptions of Indian script in the 4th and 5th centuries and later Buddhist and Hindu structures. But the context most relevant to this study emerges with the coming of colonialism, particularly the East India Company and later the British Empire. With the occupation of Penang in 1786, Seberang Perai in 1800, and Malacca in 1824, the plantations of rubber, sugarcane, oil palm, and tobacco were established to expand commerce. And there were many reasons cited for the identification of South Indian labor for recruitment in the Strait settlements. While economic vagaries and failure of agricultural crops in India pushed many laborers to look for opportunities elsewhere, including Malaya, there were also demands for plantation labor, and the colonialist impulse was to identify effective, low-cost workforce. And recruiting from North India was not preferred because it was hard to promulgate special laws for regulating recruitment and transportation in India and protection in Malaya. So the Indian colonial government decided that the labor population from the Madras presidency would be best suited to cover the labor requirements of Malaya. As one of the internal documents on labor recruitment puts it, the South Indian was perhaps the most satisfactory kind of laborer, for in addition to being a British subject accustomed to British rule, he was a good worker, not too ambitious and easily manageable. While the abolition of slavery in Britain in 1833, France in 1846, and Dutch in 1873, plantation owners were scrambling for laborers to meet the demands of labor. And this paved way for the consolidation of the indentured system as a network involving different tiers of functionaries, including the shipper, mason, Konkani manager, etc., that made use of quasi-contractual vocabulary to lure cheap labor. Moreover, the procurement of Indians was preferred for the cheap labor involved, and they formed part of what was called alien labor that was procured via indentured till 1887 for the sugarcane cultivation. So recruitment was mediated by an agent, the maestri, who on the behalf of the employer would visit the villages in India and make laborers sign a document for a 5-year contract. And many of these laborers were illiterate, as you can imagine, and didn't have much inkling into the details in the
Point
contract.
in literacy there.
Sorry for the interruption. Please continue.
Yeah. So the survey of historical records from 1884 indicates that the immigration reports from the colonies were a regular part of the bureaucratic exchange, whereby the government of India and the Protector's office received monthly reports giving details of the immigrants who left the port of Madras. The infrastructure set up to document immigration included captains of the ship being intimated to supply to the agent the port of arrival, a copy of the ship's logbook. So many of these laborers had to battle harsh conditions in Malaya, including long working hours, and they were packed into rooms with often more than 10 to 15 people sharing a room. In rubber plantations, they tapped rubber, cleaned weeds, and was paid a measly sum. The coolies were supervised by estate managers or the main Krani in charge. And educated Sri Lankan Tamils and Malayalis were hired as Kranis, and they stayed in bungalows, thus facilitating the import of a class and caste hierarchy that already existed in India. There were also toddy shops that served the workers adjacent to these estates, and women who worked in the estates also doubled up as servants in the house of Crowley. So it's a kind of an unpaid labor network that was there in the domestic labor market. The number of Indians in the region continued to increase because of the relaxed immigration policy that allowed Indians to travel to British Malaya without passports and visas, although the number dropped somewhat in the 1950s with the institution of visa norms. And many of these migrants worked in the plantation in capacity as managerial positions or as clerks, and they were joined by their relatives and families in Malaya. So, coming to the Malayali community, the areas that Malayalis migrated to were comprised of both federated and unfederated Malay states and strait settlements. And by 1957, there were roughly around 72,971 Malayalis in Singapore, making them the second largest ethnic population after the Tamils among the South Asian diaspora in Singapore. Now, this section is going to be looking more at the historical formation of the Singapore Malayali identity. So the earliest reference to the Malayali community in the region actually goes back to 1915, when R. Pillai from Seremban wrote an enquiry to the office of the British resident asking if an association by the name of Malaysia Malayalis were registered in the state of Negri Sembilan or Selangor. In 1917, Malaya Tribune, a newspaper, published an article titled Malayali Celebration. The Malayalis gathered at 148 Princep Street to celebrate the 60th birthday of the Maharaja of Travancore. And apart from the celebrations, the meeting also passed a resolution to form a permanent Malayali association and sent a congratulatory telegram to the Maharaja from the Travancoreans and the other Malayalis of Singapore. So if you look at colonial documents, you'll see that Malayali as a term is sometimes used as a category to mark racial difference. Census records from the 1912 show Malabari being catalogued as a language and Malayalam speaking people being categorized as Malabari. So there are different ways in which Malayalis are being kind of catalogued in the colonial record system. So in a document that asks the proprietor of a business establishment to write nationality and race, and if that nationality is not the nationality of origin, Malayali appears as race alongside Hindu and Malabari. So this slippage between ethnicity and racial categories may not have been accidental, but it's also likely that it signaled confusions about the essential difference from the already existing ethnic groups who were in Malaya at that point of time. The question of regional identity and constitution of a nascent sense of political consciousness was an integral part of community formation among the diaspora in the Malayan Peninsula. And as early as 1916, we will see Malayali diasporic organizations flourishing, including Malayali Hindu Samajam, Malayali Association, which comes in 1918, Malayalam Muslim Jamaat in 1929, Syrian Christian Association in 1929, among others. So it's instructive here that even though the Malayali Hindu Samajam was formed in Singapore in 1916 as an organization to unite Malayali Hindus, especially to help with the conduct of last rituals of those who die in Singapore, there have been debates on whether Malayalam or Kerala should be the core vector of their unification in the history of the diasporic groups in Singapore. Even though Singapore Malayali organizations were built on bonds of regional affiliation, they were also keen to engage with political and social events in India. So during the time of the Aikya Kerala kind of movement and protest, we'll see that Singapore-based Kerala Samajam, they actually came up with a bunch of conventions to discuss what will be good for the people of Kerala. And so in Singapore-based newspapers like the Straits Times, Indian Daily Mail, and Singapore Free Trade, you will see regular reports on the latest updates on the resolutions passed by Kerala Samajam on the Aikya Kerala proposal. Letters were published in Singapore-based Indian Daily showcasing an interesting exchange over the responsibility of Malayalis based in Singapore and Malaysia towards the United Kerala proposition. So to give you an example, in a letter published in Indian Daily Mail, while applauding the Singapore Kerala Samajam for holding the Aikya Kerala Convention, somebody who writes by the name Keralian, it's not his real name, writes that those who stay in Kerala should have the final say in what matters to them, rather than the diasporic community weighing in. So it's a very interesting way of thinking of responsibility, who really should call the shot. In Singapore Malayali Association, there were multiple efforts at coming up with different vectors to align solidarity, leading to renaming efforts more than 5 times, I would say. So the major disagreement was over which should be prioritized. Is it Kerala or Malayalam? And Kerala Mahajana Sangam, which was formed in 1917, was renamed as Malayali Association the next year, 1918. And then it was changed to Singapore Kerala Samajam in 1947. Then it became Singapore Kerala Association in 1959, and finally renamed as Singapore Malayali Association 2006. So it's interesting to think about different vectors that they followed in each of those decades. And these tensions persisted even well into the future. If one look at the archival material of the Malayali Association as from the 1970s, you will see that there is a very clear line of distinction made between Singaporean Malayali or Singaporean of Kerala origin versus Malayali from Kerala, because they thought that these are very separate categories because they have very different migration histories associated with it, and they do not want that to be conflated on any account. So when you talk about Singapore, the most important thing to know is the multiculturalism and the framework of multiculturalism used when you're talking about ethnic minorities. So multiculturalism, which was adopted constitutionally as at the founding of Singapore, provides the ideological basis for rationalization of policies and governance. Rather than ethnic differences, multiculturalism signals difference in cultural practices among identifiable cultural groups. As a multiracial nation, a legacy of migration during the colonial period, Singapore's history as a port city is invoked in the specific version of multiculturalism that the state promotes. So according to the CMIO model that I mentioned earlier, every Singaporean is racially typed at birth, being assigned the father's race, and all citizens are thereby hyphenated Singaporean who are emplaced with their own race and culture. In fact, this also assumes that every Indian is ensconced within their own religious, linguistic, and regional cultural traditions, bringing in niches of nations of stabilized population. As Chua Ben Huat writes, this logic of racialization demands active assignment of a racial category, whereby assertion of a Singaporean identity without racial boundaries are tantamount to taking a position against the state. So, this displacement of an ethnic identity by a nationalist identity means that Indian community and what they represent is limited to a set of definitions put forth and consolidated through festivals, food, preservation of the cultural idioms, etc. So, the official racial typing expands to understandings of language for each group has a corresponding national language. For instance, race and language are formally connected via government policy. And CMIO principle reflects Singapore's administrative practices while also performing multiculturalism through linguistic difference. So this is important for Malayali community. So this historical context of endangered system and this complexity of the CMIO model will be very important when we are discussing Sembawang and what Sembawang does with the fictional rendering of history, as well as the context of contemporary Singapore Malayali identity and memorial practices. Although fiction, Sembawang as a novel is informed by the history of labor migration and socio-ethnic legacies thereof. And one of the central contentions I make in the paper, which is published recently and happy to send it around, is that literary forms like Sembawang, although fictional, allow us to view the materials available in archives, photographs, ship logs, and government records through a more empathetic eye. While focusing on female characters, the novel also reorients our understanding of labor migration as a predominantly male enterprise. And in this Sembawang, although a piece of fiction shares affiliation with a growing body of work on the historical figure of the female indentured laborers, which, as Dashini Jadurai states, forces us to look at pre-globalization migration that unsettles the hegemonic narratives that position Indian diasporic subjects as ever mobile and cosmopolitan global citizens. So, moving on to the section on Sembawang. As a piece of historical fiction set in Sembawang naval base in 1960s, Aravindan Sembawang captures the lives of migrant workers of Tamil and Malayali ethnic communities in Malaysia. And Sembawang is set in the 13th mile, or what was called Sembawang Kitchil, where the Tamil estate worker from Malaysia, Kali, is welcomed by a row of kampong houses. Historically, the place Sembawang was called Kochu Kerala, Little Kerala, because of the high numbers of Malayalis staying in the neighborhood. And Malayalis were employed in the naval base quarters and naval shipyard in Sembawang, where a self-sufficient setup with provisions and utilities for the families of the employees were set up. Apart from Malayalis, Sembawang also refers to communities like Chetty Melekas, who have a mixed parentage of Indian and Malay, in an effort to actually expand the ambit within which Indian communities found representation in historical documentations. Identity cards were made for the residents of the naval base, and entry and exit were conditioned through a pass system. This actually meant that outsiders could hardly enter unless they are accompanied by somebody, staying inside the settlement, and they could be provided with passes. And Malayalis were mostly working as dockyard workers. When British left Singapore, they also gave the option of British citizenship for those who were working in the naval base for more than 5 years. So the places Malayalis stayed in Singapore include RAF Seletar, RAF Changi, Bukit Timah, and Queenstown. So the genre of historical fiction allows for weaving in of multiple characters and family histories that are scaffolded into the spatial geographies of Sembawang. And Sembawang also outlines the various regional markers through cuisines, festivals, and cultural markers that dot Singaporean Malayali identity. So just to give you an example, there is a description of a Onam festival celebrated by Malayalis, where tenants join the house owner, Sethu Lakshmi Amma, in preparing the feast. It's a community celebration and everyone partakes in it. And, even non-Malayalis like Kali, who has just moved to Singapore from the estate, finds a space in that kind of celebration. Interestingly, Sembawang pays homage to the South Indian communities, and we see like a much more robust South Indian kind of character sketch, which is very unique in the migrant narratives of Southeast Asia, because there is a dominance of narratives from Tamil because of the Malaysian Tamil culture and Singaporean Tamil kind of literary fictions, which is proliferating. So this novel is interesting because of two counts. One is like Kamaladevi Aravindan is a Malayali, but she identifies herself as a Tamil writer, and she's a prominent Tamil writer from Singapore. So, in this, what we get to see is Tamil and Malayali cultures seeping into each other, and we see tenants share bonds that replicate a quasi family where support structures are placed and communicated through appeal to the shared origins and experience of the immigrants. And the section about the writing process, and this is where I see a very interesting kind of meta reflexive process where, she writes about the writing and what does it mean to write a book of this scale. The spatial geography of migrant settlements is a crucial anchor for the narrativization of Sembawang, like the use of milestones to identify places followed in Singapore, like 13th mile or 14th mile, to spatially plot the places. The narration moves through settings, characters, and emotional states to ruminate on lost connections, desires that breaches conventional marital bonds, and earning towards self-fulfillment. So the photos sourced from various people showcase the rubber tappers who are from Ceylon, studio photographs taken at Tonglam Studio, group photographs of wedding reception, Malayalam classes conducted in Sembawang, naval base quarters, among others. And many of these photographs are from the 60s, 50s and 60s, and sourced from the personal collection of the community. So there's a community-oriented storytelling that is also part and parcel of the history of that the novel is kind of scaffolding into. And there are different spaces in Sembawang that appears here, like the maternal and childcare clinic, Pasar Malam, outdoor settings of food stalls, village hawker center, etc. And what makes Sembawang significant is a historical representation. It invokes the narrative as a commentary on the history of Singapore by annotating it with afterthoughts and introspection that showcase how characters in Sembawang were caught in a whirlwind of change, and this includes the Japanese invasion and the Death Railway, among others. The photographs, which are placed midway into the novel, thus add a new layer of meaning to the narrative. We see a photographic reproduction of a request for entry permit to Singapore, which requests a sponsor to guarantee the expenses of the entrant and the assurance that the entrant would be taken care of by the sponsor. So, one of the techniques which I think is important to mention here is that Sembawang, in its narrative posturing, extends the metaphor of a drama, a realization of the reader as someone who has to be initiated into the spatial topography of Singapore as a prerequisite to cultivate engaged readership. The novel's historical framing marked by a map of Sembawang with different locations and places marked, including bylines of schools as well as list of characters and family tree of two households that the tenants lived, offer crucial anchoring for the details that the story builds on. Moreover, there are a set of characters and a detailed glossary which offers English translation of the vernacular terms used in Malay, Tamil, and Malayalam. The prologue sets the historical framing of the novel, something that is built on by the translator's note at the very end. The characters enter and exit as if they are in a proscenium, and their background information becomes crucial in anchoring us to know their individual standing as they navigate social relations. In most cases, it is the twists and turns in their lives and in the difficult situations that they land themselves in, and how they negotiated that take center stage. And as readers, we are invited to delve into the interiority of the characters. Having distinct migration histories that's important for acculturation, Sembawang do not make an attempt to club all Malayalis into one cultural melting pot. So Aravindan is very clear about Malayalis who are coming from Kerala as opposed to the Singaporean Malayalis, and that kind of categorical distinction is very well in place, and it's also reflective of the historical kind of, situations that demanded that this conflation should not happen because the histories and experience are entirely different. So this is not really something which is distinct to Aravindan's narrative style, and I'm arguing in the paper that it's manifestation of the way in which different generations of migrants from Kerala have carved out their very different ways of engaging with who they are and what they belong in the multiracial space of Singapore. By charting out the differences and overlaps that structure their experiences, Sembawang reimagines what it would look like to be in a space where the primary sense of identification as an Indian is underplayed by regional articulations. And one of the aspects that Aravindan introduces to the reader in Sembawang is the estate life through the description of Anjanam Kattai in Malay, which is the estate in the story. The settlement offers avenues for entertainment, with Tamil films being screened on the outskirts of the estate in an open space once every 2 or 3 months. The movie van announces the details of the film screen for the night in the open air field near the estate. And this is very interesting because there are also advertisements of family planning featuring actors like Nagesh and Manorama preceding the films. And this parallels the historical reality of the estate, as many mandors or middlemen of the estate also ran small time business, owning projection equipments and renting it to other estates for their film screenings. Many estates had several divisions, and lorries actually took the laborers from one specific division to the other. There were also Tamil schools, dispensaries, shrines, grocery shops, toddy shops. So it's a kind of a settlement within itself. Historically, estates had very different kinds of housing depending on the status. So, the bungalow of a doctor who works at the clinic is going to be very different from a crani or the coolie who will be staying in barracks. And such descriptions in the novel basically mirror the historical realities of caste and class. So, an example here is that Munuswami, who is Kali's husband, he's dismissed from the estate work, and this came after he got drunk and he took some liberty with the crani, assuming that drink mates can have friendly relationship. But he was actually shown his place, especially forewarned of the consequences of what possibly would happen if anyone attempt to cross the line. Again, here crossing the line refers to both caste and class lines. After being mistreated, he had no option but to leave for Singapore, as no one will employ him in Malaysia. The tenant system is central to the social space of Sembawang. So, narratively and also perhaps historically, this system worked on the basis of trust and recommendation, where being introduced to someone who stays there or is known to the other and can vouch for the occupant is key to tenancy. So, in the novel, a character, Chidambaran, who has a government job, had to leave a room he was renting when his Chinese friend elopes with the house owner's daughter. On the other hand, collective cooking, shared space of the kitchen brought the women together. Even though this also meant lack of privacy and constant surveillance around what women do, especially when their presence in the house is being used to scrutinize their moral character, it still provided a space for women to have a group of female companions to spend time with and to support them in a space where they really don't have any kins. At the same time, tenant system also accommodated people who are left with not many options to find a place to stay. For instance, the mixed race couple, Tamil and Chinese, who didn't have a place to stay, they find their home in one of Sethu Lakshmi Amma's rooms. Care work is taken up by women who are there for each other, and when the time arises to seek support from the family, the whole Sethu Lakshmi Amma household basically comes up. And in this case, one of the tenants goes into labor and becomes a collective job and responsibility to take care of her. Despite the different caste and linguistic separations, the diasporic settlement in Sembawang shows disjunctures, especially in the novel's meticulous detailing of the social life of migrant community in Singapore. To this effect, in Sembawang, we see that the arrangement for stay is meant to accommodate a range of men, both married and unmarried, who must rely on shared rooms in houses. And there are different kinds of Malayali men we encounter in Sembawang. Single men on a lookout for partners like Apuni, who are not very keen to pursue relationship other than brief sexual rendezvous. Men who have left their families in Kerala but visit occasionally. And finally, men who bring their wives to Singapore, who then help them out with cooking and taking care of household. But the greatest value of the novel, I would argue, is the predominant focus on women and their lives. Kaliyama or Kali, a Tamil rubber tapper who leaves behind her husband and child at the rubber estate in Malaysia to elope with her Malayali lover to Singapore. Muthulachmi, who is lured by Apuni, a Malayali staying next door, and forced to end her life. Meenachi Patti, who was battling the demands of her husband's likes and dislikes in cooking, finally leaves him to take up a part-time job at the temple tying flowers into garlands and cleaning. Margaret, who was married to Mathai, only to make her life hard to avenge the hostile treatment meted out to him by her father. So, actualization of self-worth defines each of these characters, female characters, and their relationship to work. Kali doubles up as a maid in multiple households, and for her, procuring a job at a vegetable store was the only way out when her finances dwindle and her partner Chandran, the Malayali lover, starts to squander money on drinks. Later, as a live-in home maid, she doubles up as cook, assists the pregnant daughter-in-law of the home, as well as is tasked with bathing the children, and it is a back-breaking regimen that welcomed her. So when Chandran vanishes from her life by not returning, and work is the only thing that could stabilize her life in Singapore, there is one thing which is very interesting about this, which I would juxtapose with many of the Pravasa Sahityam that we are familiar with in the Middle Eastern context. because there are depictions and very vivid depictions of unmet sexual and social needs that resonate with the migrant community historically. In one example, Malayali tenant Apuni, with whom one of the female characters, Muthu Lechumi, has an affair, uses the relationship with her to find options for actualizing his desires and needs, but doesn't bat an eyelid when he has to leave her alone and pregnant to figure out things. As an unmarried man who is the sole earning member of the family, his salary is sent to Kerala for meeting the needs of his sister's marriage and house repairs, and is in no position to marry financially. While it is a sheer survival of women that he has preyed upon, Naravindan's narrative is bold to engage with sexuality and desire of migrants, which I touch upon in my first book on soft porn cinema. But again, this was very exciting for me to find that in Southeast Asian historical fiction, this is something that they are engaging with. And this is a topic still tabooed, which many of us know in the migrant literature from Kerala and especially the Pravasa Sahitya. Historical studies on Indian estate labor in the Malay Peninsula and the studies of indentured settlements elsewhere in general note that sexual tensions and complexities were always part of the settlement process. For instance, colonial records from 1901 showcases letters exchanged by the colonial secretary to the Indian government seeking help to trace the parents of a girl named Sundaram, aged 14, who appears to have been kidnapped in India and taken to Singapore for immoral purpose. Sharon Emily writes about the prevalence of prostitution, noting that most Indian women who were brought to Malay to work as prostitutes were probably located at the coffee and rubber estates, where almost 80% of the Indian migrant labor stays. Similarly, Jayature also notes that there was always a presumption that the women who were willing to leave their homes to work in a foreign country were sexually available or at least sexually vulnerable. So the depicted sexual relationship, even though flawed and exploitative ones in Sembawang, center stages women to rebuild that which narratives cannot tell us. In this way, novel comes close to what Sandhya Rao Mehta tells about its role in the historical literature in the global Anglophone context, and this is what she talks about. Post-indentured feminism and its literature's attempts to look beyond national ethnicities to a transnational experience. So this is one of the kind of things I take upon in my larger work on the Malaysian rubber plantations and the visual iconographies around it. So the affective experience of gendered relationship, for example, are central to Sembawang, and a key way in which Aravindan feminizes the affective lens used to imagine and revisit histories of migration. So, to conclude, what can we learn from Aravindan's historical fiction in relation to an Indo-Asia concern? Sembawang, I argue, offer two possibilities for further research. One related to diasporic memorialization and identity building, and the other gesturing towards the Indo-Asian method. First, in relation to the diasporic memorializing, Sembawang situates itself amidst media produced by diasporic communities to write their own histories, aligning with Singapore's efforts in preserving culture and history of its multi-ethnic and racial community. The attempt of the Singaporean Malayalis to actively partake in the preservation and writing of their own history is revelatory. Unlike other diasporic communities which have a predominant media production culture like the Middle Eastern Gulf, Malayali culture and media production in Singapore, I argue, has an ethnographic and archival impulse behind it. Writing about the production of diasporic media more generally, Hamid Nafisi has identified a dominant pattern of historicization that encapsulates the political need of the community to write themselves into history as a factor that enables the production of diasporic media as a genre. This is certainly true for the diasporic media production in Singapore, but the mode of historical writing has undergone a shift from the early periods of community organizing in the 1950s and 60s to the contemporary moment. The basic impulse has always been to address the historical memory and fragmented selfhood in diasporic consciousness. In the Singaporean Malayali community, one can see an impulse to maintain an equilibrium between the Singaporean multi-ethnic culture, the CMIO model, while safeguarding Malayali cultural attributes from being co-opted by the general ethnic label of Tamil. So in interweaving migration trajectories with experiential accounts and anecdotal evidence, these works posit a political commitment to preserve the memory of migration and cultural assimilation. Recent attempts on the part of the community to historicize their past has taken forms of initiatives that has resulted in books like From Kerala to Singapore, Voices from the Singapore Malayali Community, penned by Anudha Devi Pillai, who is a third-generation Singaporean Malayali, again daughter of Kamala Devi Aravindan, and the translator of the work Sembawang into English. As an oral history project that taps into the reminiscences of the community, the author's own insider status allows her to move back and forth between the individual accounts and the spatial aspects of Malayali enclave that her respondents evoke through their experiential memory of Singapore. The diasporic subject that emerges through this account is proactively invested in writing one's own family history and journey. And the book, From Kerala to Singapore, incorporates the use of family trees, personal photographs, and snippets of information about the process of moving to a new place. The family tree actually begins with mapping the Taravada, ancestral family, and then branches out into the present generation. While this on the first glance, it might look like an individual portrait, it's equally invested in the family history and the act of recounting the process of migration through one's own predecessors who have made this transition materialize. So each portrait here will begin with roots in Singapore since 1918 or whichever date their ancestor has migrated. So Sembawang, I argue, exists on this continuum with such efforts of the diasporic community to come to terms with the complexities of their national and ethnic identities. The diasporic subject here emerges as an amateur historian with the task of documenting the history of the community or as a cultural arbitrator, smoothing the merits of ethnic integration. Underlying the idea of fragmented selfhood is the realization that discrete individual units have to be considered as part of the comprehensive whole that is expanding its orbit constantly. So the second set of possibilities I suggest are more directly iteration. Daniel Go suggests that one of the key interventions in the iteration approach is to transgress and deconstruct national boundaries that have reified colonial understanding into geopolitical fact since the Cold War. Sembawang does not deal with the Cold War, of course, but it is very deeply embedded in the colonial context. Tracing the history's reference in the novel requires us to reimagine a time when national boundaries, national identities, and ethnic identities were emerging in a period of massive intercultural flux. But this also gestures towards previous world where our current geopolitical systems' insistence on national identities fixed on paper were not yet political fact. Whether the complexities of identification of South India, Malabari, Malayali, or Singapore Malayali, or the movement of people under the conditions of indenture and slavery, but equally sometimes journeys of aspiration and hope for a better future, such historical fiction and such historically informed research force us to imagine alternative possibilities of living and worlding. We'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Darshana. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I request all the attendees, if they have any questions, we are open for the Q&A. So if there are any questions, either they can raise your hand or they can type the questions in the chat box. I can read it out.
May I ask?
Yeah, please, sir.
I got 2-3 comments. One is a methodological problem, which I'll resolve towards the end. But there is a problem regarding Singapore and Malaysia. Do we treat the histories of diaspora in Malaysia and Singapore as identical or different? I think that Singapore migration was taking place. I'm talking purely as a historian and not as a literary person at all. I don't have anything to do with that literature at all. So the Singapore migration was taking place slightly later, primarily because of the fact that Singapore became basically a mercantile center which linked the trade between India, Southeast Asia, and China, including Japan, and it acted as a kind of a port which actually exchanged these processes. So which means that what you call as a CMU model is something that is applicable only to Singapore and not to Malaysia. Malaysian labor is somewhat different, and it actually started taking place much earlier. That is, from 19th century end onwards, you have got the Tamil laborers and Sri Lankan laborers actually moving on to Malaysia, and they were brought in there primarily to work in plantations, which included the rubber farms. That is in 20th century. So the Singapore and Malaysia doesn't seem to be actually historically cannot be placed at the same level. That is one thing. Second thing is the question of South Asians. As you were pointing out, you said that North Indians were not coming in primarily because the difficulties in procuring them, and South Indians were easily procured. But the point is that North Indians were procured to West Indies,
Yes.
which is much further than this. Because the Bihari as well as the laborers they were actually being brought to West Indies and were made to work in sugar plantations. And the Trinidad and Tobago is one particular area where North Indian laborers are settled. So it is not a question of distance or difficulties in procuring them, but it's a question of labor itself, which you have not gone into at all. The point is that the type of labor in plantations, Sri Lankans were more familiar, Tamils were more familiar, but then also the Malayalis. Particularly the Tamils were more familiar, and as a result, they were actually recruiting labor from those people who were already familiar with the kind of labor, and they were recruiting from there. So that distinction will have to be made primarily because of the fact that you have not really looked into why and how labor migrations are taking place. You are only looking into the people who are settled there, but not exactly as to how the labor migrations are taking place. If that had to be included, then probably this would have been much more clearer, I think. That is one. Second thing. Third thing is the question of Singapore. So Singapore is I don't know whether you can call it as an interration. There is something which is typically global, the present, neoliberal global kind of a position that you are taking, which I don't think that is a position that one should take. Because Singapore was, like in many places, it was a colonial settler state. It was actually a colonial actually entrepreneur which was settled. The whole area was settled, and that is why you have got the CMIO kind of combination coming up there. So the whole area was settled. They were trying to settle Hong Kong also in a similar way, but they didn't succeed because of a very, very powerful indigenous Chinese population there. So in the case of Singapore, it is totally different because then already that area was actually settled by traders, including your Chetty Vellalas whom you are pointing out, also the Chinese. So naturally, all that is necessary is to bring in people from Malayalis and Tamils, etc., work in the dockyards as well as in the trading depots and make them work there, which is very different from the type of labor that was existing in the other parts of Malaysia. So this distinctions will have to be understood. That is another thing that is important. And finally, the whole question of methodology that I'm very sorry to say, I'm very, very conventional, old-fashioned history teacher and researcher. Say, I disagree with Hayden White, one. Say, I disagree with Hayden White's methodology also. That is my problem. Anyway, but the point is that the more important thing is that, you see, can we move from historical novel to history? How do we navigate from historical novel to actual history? This is a methodological issue which I'm trying to pose before you. Can we say that, for example, the portrayal which you are given by Aravindan in your novel actually depicts the kind of migrations that were taking place there, and trying to have how far have we actually gone into that at all? How far have we gone into the question of migrations and tried to solve the problem of how people were coming in there? What were the kind of compulsions that they brought by which they were brought there? Is the question of how do we analyze it? How was this particular settlement which you're pointing out actually was formed? If at all that settlement actually exists, I don't know. That is why I'm saying it. If it exists, it's fine. Now, how far that is formed? How far can we go moving from there, from a novel that is a fictional representation to the actual, the process of the forming of Singapore community? How will you sort of resolve that issue? That is something which you have got to look into. Because without that, there is no point in talking about possibilities of an iteration. See, I personally think that without looking into the process of colonialism, how colonialism established that kind of that kind of a city there, which is a settler city, you cannot go into any kind of iteration kind of a situation that is existing today. I think that kind of, possibilities cannot be explored through a novel. If it is to be explored, it has to be explored differently, I feel. You cannot, for example, I'm sorry to use another example. You cannot use Kalki's Ponniyin Selvan and the cinematic representation of, Ponniyin Selvan to explore Chola history. That is not the way one should do Chola history, I believe. So despite the very good, excellent kind of, possibilities like photographs, like other kinds of material that she has provided, I think one has to go beyond that and try to explore the history of Singapore. That is what I believe.
Thank you so much. This is a really interesting set of provocations, and I actually would like to respond to it. If we have more questions, we can take it. So this is part of a larger book project, which is looking at the labor migration of indentured labor from South India to Malaysia, to Peninsular Malaysia. So you're absolutely right. I'm not going to conflate the migration to Malaysia with Singapore. But at the same time, this novel has a significant investment in the Malaysian rubber plantation. So I thought it's important for us to talk about the different scales of migration, because not everyone migrated as, let's say, Krani, or for that matter, as a supervisor or as a manager. There are rubber tappers, and there were internal hierarchies and tensions within the Indian community in the plantation. So my larger work looks at rubber plantation as a space and the visual infrastructures through which colonial government documented it, the coming of photography and documentation techniques and films to actually document this material and send it back to the shareholders back. And how did Malaysian Tamils, make use of photography to sell fashion and co-opt a colonial apparatus in order to articulate their claims making. So I'm looking at this as a partly historical and partly ethnographical project. The book, I'm sure, not might be to the interest of you, but again, the use of methodology is very intentional here. Because I think that, you can be a historian, you can actually look for objective facts, but there's also one way in which you can juxtapose the facts that you find in the archive. So in the longer project, if you look at it, I have a lot of material from the archives, from the Tamil Nadu State Archives, from the Malaysian archives, from the Singaporean archives, because I wanted to actually place what Kamaladevi Aravindan is saying in the larger context of how a historian would read a text. So I completely take your suggestion about needing to mark the distinction between the different trajectories of migration, Singapore being a port city, and the early migration of rubber tappers goes as early as 1890s. So that's something I'm actually getting the material from the National Archives. So it is historically verifiable in terms of the facts I'm working with. But I think, a multi-sited ethnography, understanding where do Malaysian Tamils currently stand in the geopolitics of Singapore. So Malaysia is important. Singapore and Malaysia are very different in the contemporary moment, but it's equally important to think that, why South Indian labor was imported for Malaysian plantation was also very strategic. They wanted to create a settlement, and the settlement with people who speak the same language, who have the same cultural similarities, and were able to gel well. And I found documents in the Malaysian archives and also in the British archives, which speaks to the extent that they did not want North Indians. So the aftermath of that is that the indentured labor and the plantation diasporas in Southeast Asia is very different from what we see in Trinidad, or for that matter, Mauritius, because they were able to integrate much more into the dominant community, and they also have cultural and political leverage, which many Malaysian Indian community did not have. They are still being seen as second-tier citizens, and even though CMIO model is not followed in its entirety as much as the Singaporean context, there is a model which is followed there, which is Bhumiputra and the ethnic other. And Indians are ethnic others, and currently there is only 6.5% of Malaysian Indians in Malaysia, because there is a huge out-migration because of the resurgence of Bhumiputra. So this project is also trying to tap into the aftermaths of indenture. What did happen? While historical records and documents fascinate me, and I love, trying to take the garb of a historian, I also think that there is something else that the cultural sphere can provide, right? For Kamaladevi Aravindan, she cannot write against the government by saying that we are being clubbed as Tamil and we are not Tamil, we are Malayalis. For her, historical fiction and use of historical fiction is a political strategy. So much so that she can use it into the realm of fiction, take some liberties to make a claim that Malayali community is different. Indian cannot be seen as equivalent to Tamil, which is used in the CMIO model. So I wanted to read between the lines, try to understand the resistance of the contemporary diasporic Singaporeans, because I think I do understand that, your concern about why Interasia, right? Are we all going to get into the bandwagon of the kind of neoliberal, system that Singapore is kind of putting forth in terms of cosmopolitanism and the global, which has already reached its zenith? I'm not doing that. But I'm also trying to think about how knowledge systems have been produced. My provocation for the Interasia is coming from Kwang Sing Chen, who actually wanted to make the argument in terms of how, colonial archives have been used so much that we are unable to understand the connections between regions. For instance, Japanese invasion in Singapore, right? A lot of material in Japan, and the conversation with Japanese scholars working on the 1940s can tell us a lot about Malayalis who basically work with the Japanese government during the invasion. There are memoirs, there are letters, there are a lot of things that you can find in the archives. So my iteration method is also to move away from nation state and to say that colonial archive cannot be the only way through which we are crafting the history or reworking and analyzing what happened in the past. The past and present and future are integrally connected. Maybe I'm a Henry Bergson fan in the making, but I think there is something about the need to think about what happened in the past that seeps into the present and it moves into the future. And as far as the Malaysian Tamil community is concerned, there's a resurgence of interest in plantation lineage. If plantation lineage was considered as a taboo earlier, right now you see Malaysian Tamil community wholeheartedly embracing the fact that they are of plantation lineage. And plantation media becomes like very vibrant, a lot of films, documentaries, community projects where they are claiming that they have been part of Malaysia for a very long time. They're not recently entered immigrants, but they are part of the plantation diaspora. So I'm interested in kind of working through those complications, and I really, really appreciate, because I always would love to hear what a historian would think about a project of this scale. Thanks.
Thank you, Darshana. Is there any more questions? Please raise your hand or please write in the chat box.
Earlier, there were a few comments. Please look at the chat box.
I actually can't see the chat box.
Me too. I can't see the chat box.
Something about CMIA again.
Again, okay. Would you mind actually reading out if you can see the question? Because
I can't.
everything is.
It has disappeared with me. So if it is
Even
there,
I can't
I think
see the question.
Somi can find it.
Yeah, I'm also trying to find it, but I couldn't also see any chats. Is there any questions? Please write it down. If you either you can raise your hand or you can write down. I can't find any questions in the chat box. I couldn't find any comments also.
No, the comment was on whether CMIO can be used as a model for, a diasporic migration. Basically that. Is there a model like that? Is there the possibility of building such models? I think the model is a bit too, according to him, not my position, a bit too far-fetched.
Yeah, I mean, CMIO model is a very taxonomical model which is borrowing from the colonial kind of, bureaucratic functioning. So according to CMIO model, there is no scope for interracial relationship. So let's say that a Chinese man marries a Indian woman. They will not have a space in the CMIO model, because CMIO model basically, squarely places one race with one language and one culture. So it is very constrained in that ways. And, again, that is one way in which they are defining multiculturalism. And again, Singaporean mode of multiculturalism is also like, eliminating any kind of dissent, right? You are basically creating a consensus that is created so much so that you do not want it to think beyond the model. So the model becomes the be all and end all, that people are very reluctant to speak against CMIO model. So speaking against CMIO model is seen as speaking against the state. So it's a very interesting model, but the CMIO model is not used in its entirety in Malaysia. Because in Malaysia right now there is it has been for a very long time, the whole
So,
Bhumiputra resurgence.
so what you say is that basically Singapore administration is racist.
Not racist. I think, they have done it for a purpose during the founding of Singapore, like especially after, Singapore left the federation, left Malaysia because of their difference of opinion
So
in what
that it's quite
multinationalism would look
possible,
like.
I'm saying. This
Yeah, it's quite
possibility of that.
possible. Yeah, I mean, again, like, governmental systems and structures and ideological kind of undercurrents are quite complicated. So if you speak to Singaporeans, nobody would say anything against CMIO model. And that's one of the very interesting conversations I had with many of my
It's a different
respondents.
thing.
Yeah, but if you talk to Malaysia, like Malaysian Tamils, Malaysian Malayalis, they're a little more kind of forthcoming in telling about what they feel about the current system. And that
But
is the
there are,
kind of,
I think there are ways in which your own novel seems to have transgressed the model. You have already pointed out several people actually entering into relationships with other sections and also
yes,
sexual relationships, which you pointed
yes,
out, which means
yeah,
that
yeah,
it is being transgressed. So the
yes. I mean,
model actually doesn't exist in reality. It actually is being transgressed. So
yes,
that is the
I think,
point which I think one has to explore further.
yeah,
So
totally,
this
totally.
caste, etc., doesn't exist anymore among the diaspora community. I mean, that it actually is breaking down.
Yeah, but one thing interesting is that there is a lot of emphasis on language. Malayalam language
Could be.
classes are
That could
happening
that could
in
be.
Singapore. And one of the reasons is that like they cannot teach Malayalam in schools there in Singapore. With the Cambridge University system, Tamil is accommodated, Punjabi and Hindi is accommodated, but not Malayalam. And the Malayali associations have been, calling for, efforts to basically add Malayalam, which has not happened yet. So they founded a society to teach Malayalam separately. So they are in tie-up
That
with the
is very
government of
different from
Kenya.
caste and ethnicity.
Sorry?
No, that is very different from caste and ethnicity.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm just saying that, caste and ethnicity, yeah, of course. I mean, questions about caste are also very interesting in both the contexts, both Tamil, the Malaysian context and the rubber plantation context, because in some of the older documents I was looking at, there were also kind of allegations about how the barracks were allotted, and the very fact that the Krani, who is an insider, who knows about the caste system, might have already known which caste some people belong to. So people who came from certain caste groups were given accommodations together, some others were given differently. So caste is kind of a living reality that props up over and over again in the plantation economy. So, Dravidian movement was also very prevalent, and back and forth conversation between Tamil Nadu and many of these plantations where you have visitors, there are Tamil films being screened. So it's interesting that, it's not like an isolated diasporic community. So the way I would say is like, Malaysia was like one of the places where Indian government thought that they needed to basically protect the laborer. So the protectorate system had its first base in Malaya, because they wanted the laborers to be protected, ensure that they are being supported, their wage rates are okay. So there was an Indian protectorate in Malaysia as early as 1930s, which is an interesting fact because it also ties up to the larger debates about, what does it mean for the state to play an active role in facilitating and supporting labor migration elsewhere. But this was not always the case with the migration of indentured labor in Mauritius, for instance.
Is there any more questions? The chat box is open to everyone. You can either type in the chat box or raise your hands, please. If there is no questions, can we wind up the session, or do we need to wait for some more time?
No, there are no questions. You can wind it up.
Yes. So thank you, Darshana, for the wonderful session, and we looking forward for more few more discussions on your for your further work. And thank you all the participants, and thank you all for the panelists for attending this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming, everyone. And thanks for KCHR for organizing it.
Welcome.